Thanks everyone for coming out. I know it's late in the afternoon, so I appreciate you guys taking the time. My name's Mary. I work at AltspaceVR and I'm a product manager there. I have been for the last 3 years. It's been a really fun experience. And I'd love to tell you more about what we've learned about harassment in VR and our approach going forward with how we handle it. I'm hoping that the stories I can tell about where we've been will help you with any development that you guys are doing, any VR products you're creating, so you can get out ahead of things before it becomes an actual problem for you. So the first thing I want to talk about is what is harassment and why should you care? I'm guessing some of you showed up here because you're working on something and actively know you want to address it, and some of you had no idea this was a problem and just thought this was on the calendar and you should show up. So I would propose that you should care a lot, actually. Harassment in the real world is an issue in the workplace, in schools, in other public locations, and it's also an issue online and a growing issue online. A Pew study from 2014 says that 60% of online bullying and harassment is in social networking, and 16% of it in gaming, and 10% on discussion sites like Reddit. So this is an issue that is in real life, it's online, and it just seems to be where people gather. Harassment tends to follow, unfortunately. And so now, with the advent of social VR and multiplayer games, it's going to follow into VR too, and it already has begun to. So the thing that's interesting about harassment in VR is we've all done the demos now. It's late in the conference, or hopefully you have. And we know how visceral VR can be. When you're, crouching down behind that wall, shooting at the aliens coming at you or whatever it is, it feels very real. That's the appeal of VR. And also, when someone reaches for your face very abruptly, that also feels very real. And it's startling. So this is an issue, not only a social moral issue, but it's also a business issue. Studies in gaming have shown that if a user is encountering a toxic environment, they're 320% less likely to come back. So if you care about your business and you think harassment might be an issue, I'd recommend looking into it. So I'd like to tell the story of 2 users. For lack of my creative naming, we have Sad Sam and Happy Hannah. So Sad Sam, he was given a Gear VR for Christmas. Never really tried VR before, heard about it, thought it looked interesting. He went and downloaded a bunch of free apps, and in this case, we'll say he also downloaded Altspace. He logged in, he landed in some community space, there were a bunch of people around, maybe, and someone came up to him, speaking in another language, and started getting right in his face, repeatedly. And he got really startled by all this, and meanwhile, there's like some racy TV show on in the background. Sad Sam did not have a good time. This was not a good experience for him. He had people aggressively approaching him, speaking languages he didn't understand. He bounced out, he quit, and he's in that 320% that is not likely to come back. By contrast, we have Happy Hannah. Hannah also didn't know anything about Gear VR, or about VR in general, and was given a Gear VR for Christmas. Some friend of hers from France told her about Altspace and said that she should go download it, so she downloads it. She shows up, she logs in, she lands in the community space, and her friend from France is speaking French and comes up to her and gives her the traditional French greeting, mwah, mwah. And it turns out their favorite scene from Grey's Anatomy is playing on the TV. Happy Hannah had a great time. She's chilling out with her friends, watching her favorite content, meeting new people. She's totally coming back. She's checking in and wanting to see what else she can do in social VR. So what happened here? What is the difference between these 2 users? Functionally, in terms of the data, they look the same. They didn't know about VR, they were given a Gear VR, they just showed up one day, they entered the same space, the same content was there, the same users were there, but they had vastly different experiences. I point this out to say that harassment is nuanced. It's not a blanket statement, it's not a blanket behavior. It depends on context, it depends on what's going on in the environment, and it depends on someone's personal history. So if everything is nuanced, how can you begin to take on harassment in your VR products? I would propose that it's best to take a multi-pronged approach. Just putting out fires and taking on issues one by one is bound to cause some problems. You're going to miss things, and there'll be some nasty missteps. So I would propose that a better multi-pronged approach would be to look at a company level first, and then move down to the product level, and then get to specific feature levels. So let's start with company. The first thing is you should have a stance on harassment. And I would propose that the first step to having a stance on harassment is to have open and honest communication in your company. This is everyone's favorite thing, right? Everyone wants to have really hard conversations with their coworkers. But I would say it's really important. For AltSpace, we all had to sit around and tell personal stories of things that had happened for us so people could respect and understand where we came from. I ended up telling my coworkers about a story where a man followed me home to my house in a car, and so now when people follow me around, I get really creeped out. It's not often a thing you tend to like to share with your coworkers, but it's really important for everyone to know where everyone else is coming from and to understand why they're saying the things that they're saying. And they may have good points. And as a listener, you need to not judge. So you've had these hard conversations. You're starting to generate a stance. OK, so now what? Well, now you can start to put it into a little more tangible things. You can start to develop your community standards, write your terms of service. A big thing for us at AltSpace, we determined that the best possible experience we could have users engage in was to be a new user, land in a space, and meet a real person that could greet them and help them with any technical problems they might have. So if you go into AltSpace right now, 24/7, even on holidays, you will encounter a real employee of AltSpace. We lovingly call them the road team. And they hang out in there to help our users. It's probably one of the best investments we've ever made. Also, I'd like to advocate that everyone find all the avenues you can to keep in touch with your users. Hang out in your product. Build relationships with your key users. They're going to be your canaries in the coal mine for when things are starting to look a little shaky. Have support tickets, have abuse tickets, check your forums, check your social media, read your store reviews, even have user interviews and studies. These are all things that will help you get a better picture of what's going on in your product and what really matters to your users. So at this point, we haven't built anything. No features have been made. So now let's start to look at your specific product that you're forming. So this is still a high-level view of your product. Identify your main vectors of abuse within your product. So where could things start to go wrong, maybe? So do you let users enter usernames? Could that be a form of abuse, potentially? Are you going to commit to monitoring that? Maybe. Do you let users share content or share screens? Could that be a vector of abuse? What if someone is shown content they didn't like in our stories earlier with Sam and Hannah? How does that pan out for you? And where does your user flow direct them to? Are you fundamentally an experience that directs users to hang out with their friends or to hang out with strangers? Because this can also highly tailor what you're going to need to do to prevent harassment in your product. So as an example, our designers are going to love that I showed this slide with a design bug on it. But maybe you land in AltSpace. You land in VR, and you already have friends. Maybe you knew them in the real world, maybe you didn't, you met them in VR, now you guys are friends. And like I said before, we fundamentally believe that if you encounter a real person, you're gonna have a great time. And we think even more than that, if you encounter a friend, someone you know, whether you know them from VR or real life, you're gonna have a fundamentally better experience. You share social norms with them, you share commonalities with them. These are people you get a little more flexibility with. So, just, I think last week, we redid our homepage to have it so that the first thing you see when you open are your online friends. We want you to be able to jump straight to where your friends are and be able to share that kind of experience with them. So another situation, though, is that sometimes maybe you don't know someone who's online. Maybe none of your friends happen to be online. Maybe you're new to VR. You don't know anybody. You end up having to hang out with people you don't know. That's fine. That happens in AltSpace, too. We have a space called the Campfire that's sort of a community space for everyone to hang out. But we very intentionally considered, what is the best possible thing that we could have users do? How can we give them something constructive? And so we put a silly but fun game up where you get to ask icebreaker questions. So maybe you get to make a new friend, and then you get to engage as a friend in the friends list that I showed you earlier. So this is something to consider. How can you give people, regardless of their experience, regardless of how they're entering your product, the best possible experience and default them to the right thing? So for the record, by the way, the animal that best represents me, I'd say a wolf. You can come tell me yours afterwards. So this is still pretty high-level stuff, right? But I mentioned the goal above was to identify vectors of possible abuse. So this is where we start to get into specific features to combat those vectors of abuse. So one thing that AltSpace did we integrated controllers in VR. So now you have hands in VR with the Vive controller, with the touch controller, et cetera, leap motion. And the first thing people decided they wanted to go do was go touch other people. Sometimes non-maliciously, but as I mentioned with the story with Stan, sometimes it's just startling. And so one of the features we worked on to deal with this was one we lovingly call the space bubble. And this was a particularly challenging feature for a number of reasons. But fundamentally, we wanted to default users to the right thing. So when you land in AltSpace, your space bubble by default is on, and it creates this invisible wall around you. So when users come up and try and reach for you, their hands will disappear for you and become transparent to them as if something has gone wrong to indicate, hey, this is a no-go space. We've seen this be actually quite effective, but it's less about the specific implementation, although that's important too, but it's really about how can we default users into a good behavior and then let them opt out. If they're with your friends, you want to give them a hug, that's fine, go ahead, turn it off. It doesn't matter. But you're opting into that experience as a user. And I would posit that this is a proactive feature. This is something that just works when you log in. By contrast, there's reactive features. So this is for when everything has gone wrong, and you can't account for every avenue of things that will happen. So you got to give users a way out, an eject button. Unfortunately, by this point, they've probably already had a bad experience. So one of the features that we implemented was the block feature. And so this means that if I block you, you and I will disappear for each other, but everyone else in the room can still see us. And so this is sort of the nuclear option. By the time you've gotten this far, something's gone wrong. And then after you block someone, it asks you for a reason why. And that's really a way for us to help to understand what's better going on in our system, to understand who's interacting with who and what kinds of things are causing problems in what situation, and let us follow up if necessary. But this is something that'll give us more traction to move forward and more ways to reach out, if need be. So, this is just a short example of a few things. And I do want to preface what I'll say next by saying there's no perfect system. This is a challenging area. New things crop up all the time. But I would like to go ahead and share some of the results that we've had from taking this company product feature approach. In 2016, we introduced the space bubble and activities with friends, which we didn't really talk about here, but basically it's a way for you to go hang out with friends, like we talked about before. And when we introduced those, we saw violations of our community standards go down by about 40%. And over that amount of time, our user base increased, which meant our incident rate decreased even more to about 80% less than it was before. And the blocks that we were talking about, that you can go block your users, those decreased by 90%. So taking this top-down approach has really given us a good traction for moving things forward and really puts us in a good trajectory for our users. Now, as always, not all users report abuse. Not everything can be captured. But I do think that our trajectory in prevention is going well, and it's something we're committed to going forward. So I mentioned before that the UI, where you can see your friends list first, that's a new feature. Also, the text under the block button I showed before, the text itself is a new feature. It's all small, but this was feedback we got from users about things that would make the experience better for them. So I say that to say that this is a continual improvement that we and you, as you go forward, will have to continue to build on. So that said, I would like to say thanks for coming. It takes a whole team and it takes a whole VR community to prevent harassment in VR. So I hope you'll learn from a little bit from our story, and you'll be able to go out and make VR better for everybody. Thanks. And I think that was fast, so we have time for questions if anybody has any. Yes?
Is there anything that you do to encourage users within the system to moderate each other?
The blocking is the closest we get to moderating each other. So it's more of a one-on-one interaction between the two where they disappear for each other. But we don't currently provide that feedback to the user being blocked specifically at this moment.
Are there any heuristics or metrics that you have to help you identify like potential trolls in the system?
Yeah, that's a great question. He asked if there are any heuristics or metrics for identifying trolls. It's something that's very interesting. I would also posit that it's also very delicate for the reasons I mentioned above. The same behavior in data can be very different in the real world. So nothing yet, and I would be interested if people were doing that, but I would also proceed with caution.
Do you collect any data on the personality of your users before you try to give them some options to help with?
He asked if we collect personality data on our users to help understand who falls in what category. We don't, and it's an interesting idea. I haven't heard of that. I would be curious if someone tried it to let me know how it goes, actually, though. Yeah. Anything else? Mm-hmm.
For the safety bubble, like what happens when a user had actually come closer to the other user?
Yeah, the head will disappear for the individual whose space is being violated, but for the room, it actually stays in the same place. But it's sort of removing the target of harassment from the harasser.
So each one will not see each other.
Correct. Yeah, but the room still will. Mm-hmm.
Have you found either actions or instances of harassment or abuse that are new to VR? Something that like wouldn't bother somebody, or situations that maybe wouldn't be such a big deal in real life, but people just get freaked out because it's in VR or all.
Yeah, so it depends on what you want to call harassment. I would say there's harassment, trolling, and abuse sort of start to overlap at some point. And he asked if there were unique VR harassment behaviors. I think the ones that are most unique in VR are ones where people are taking advantage of the technology. So one thing is like on a Vive, you can reset your headset to be taller than another user and then kind of bear down on them. It's not really something that happens in real life unless you want to stand on a table. So that's one that is kind of interesting. But certainly, I think what's actually been more surprising are the things that are very normal in real-world interactions. Like I'm physically close to you and I try and touch your face. There's almost no scenario where touching someone's face feels appropriate. And so it's surprising how many people are willing to do things they wouldn't do in real life. Often benignly, but it still creates a really bad experience for the other individual. Sorry, repeat your question?
Not just touching really like punching or something. Well, basically.
Yeah, so,
Attacking rather than harassing.
sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
Just attacking somebody else.
Yeah. I think some people certainly do touch each other maliciously, like they're intending to harm. A lot of people are just trying to understand what happens when they do certain things. So like, oh, in the real world, I know what my hands do. That's not exciting. But in the VR world, I don't know if when I swipe at something, is it gonna go through my hand? Is it gonna not? And so you get a little bit of experimentation, but I think that's why it's important to also, part of the reason we made the hands go transparent is like, hey, this is a zone that you don't want to be in. And people seem to get that. So there's ways to better communicate what is and isn't okay, even if it's not directly through, messaging or whatever. Mm-hmm.
Have you experimented with or seen people use language to communicate that, other than a normal harassment policy, or abuse policy, which you should have anyway, but that says we're a safe space, if we actively pay attention? It's early days, so maybe not, but I make training software, and this would be a thing that I would want to say, is that we've done things to make it so that this is a safe space.
Yeah, so he asked if people try to communicate that this is a safe space via text or messaging in some way in their product. Yeah, I think you can try and deliver that message literally or figuratively. Your product looks friendly or it doesn't. And also consider how you're guaranteeing that as well.
Do you announce features? Like that would be a way
Oh.
to do it, right? Like you guys have this bubble. You say,
Right. We
FYI.
do announce features. Yeah. So we will put changes out when we push a new build, and we'll also when it's a big feature change like the space bubble or like some of these other ones, we make blog posts and share that out to our users. So we do try and communicate that as much as possible. We also try and have predominant spaces where we say, hey, here's our terms of service, here's our conditions, things like that. Anything else? Great. Well, I think we're over time, so that's good timing. Thanks, everybody.